The Galactic Wildlife Preservation Council had made what they considered a perfectly reasonable decision: send the most expendable species to handle their most dangerous problem. After all, humans were soft, slow, and had an alarming tendency to die from things that barely inconvenienced proper civilized beings. Who better to document the final extinction of the Vorthak apex predators than a species that would probably get eaten in the process? "This is such a brilliant plan," muttered Dr. Elena Vasquez as she stepped off the transport onto Kepler-7, her boots squelching into what the mission briefing had euphemistically called nutrient-rich soil, but which was clearly just alien mud. Send the squishy human to babysit a bunch of carnivorous cubs whose parents could bench press a shuttle. What could possibly go wrong? The Zephyrian expedition leader, Commander Thexval, towered over her with all the intimidating presence of a 7-foot crystalline mantis wearing military decorations. "Human Vasquez, your role is purely observational. You will document the natural selection process as the river floods eliminate the weaker specimens. This data will be invaluable for our preservation archives." Elena adjusted her waterproof gear and glanced at the roiling brown water that was already lapping at the edges of the Vorthak den site. The natural selection process looked suspiciously like a bunch of fuzzy alien toddlers about to get swept away by what was essentially a flash flood. But apparently pointing this out would be interfering with natural processes. "Right, because watching kids drown is totally natural selection and not just shitty timing," she said under her breath, then louder. "And the adult Vorthaks are where, exactly?" "Hunting," replied the Zephyrian, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "They will return in approximately 6 standard hours. The cubs will either survive through genetic superiority or perish as nature intended." Elena stared at him. "You do realize that's not how evolution works, right? Like, at all. A flood isn't selecting for genetic fitness. It's just a flood." Commander Thexval's antennae twitched in what she was learning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of dismissive condescension. Humans lack the scientific objectivity necessary to understand complex ecological processes. Your emotional responses cloud rational judgment. "My emotional responses," Elena repeated slowly, watching as water began seeping into the den entrance where she could hear the cubs making distressed chittering sounds. "Right. Because wanting to prevent unnecessary death is so irrational." The other expedition members, a mix of Andromedans, Centaurians, and what appeared to be a very bored Rigelian anthropologist, had positioned themselves at a safe distance with their recording equipment. They were treating this like a nature documentary, complete with hushed commentary about the harsh realities of survival and the brutal efficiency of natural selection. Elena walked closer to the den entrance, ignoring the increasingly urgent chittering from inside. The water was rising faster than the briefing had suggested, which wasn't surprising since the briefing had been written by people who thought observe from a safe distance was appropriate advice for dealing with a humanitarian crisis. "The cubs appear to be vocalizing distress signals," noted the Rigelian, speaking into his recorder. "This behavior indicates awareness of impending mortality, suggesting higher cognitive function than previously documented." "They're scared," Elena said flatly. "They're babies, and they're scared because they're about to drown. You don't need a xenobiology degree to figure that out." "Human emotional projection is a well-documented phenomenon," Commander Thexval observed. "You are attributing human emotional states to alien lifeforms based on superficial behavioral similarities." Elena turned to stare at him again. "Are you seriously mansplaining fear to me right now? Fear is like the most basic survival emotion in the universe. Every species that's managed to not go extinct has it." The chittering from the den was getting more frantic, and Elena could see small furry faces appearing at the entrance before retreating as water splashed inside. The cubs looked like a cross between puppies and baby bears, if puppies and baby bears had 6 legs and bioluminescent stripes. They were also clearly terrified, regardless of what the expedition's scientific objectivity had to say about it. "The water level has reached critical threshold," announced one of the Andromedans. "Immersion appears imminent." Elena looked at the assembled scientists, all of whom were maintaining their careful observation positions while baby aliens were about to die 20 feet away. So we're really doing this. We're really just going to stand here and watch. It is the most scientifically sound approach, Commander Thexavol confirmed. Intervention would compromise the integrity of the natural process. The natural process, Elena said, pulling off her jacket and kicking off her boots, can kiss my scientifically objective ass. She waded into the rapidly rising water before anyone could stop her, though judging by the shocked chittering from the expedition team, stopping her hadn't occurred to any of them as a possibility. The water was cold and moving fast, but Elena had grown up swimming in the Pacific during storm season. This was basically like a slightly more aggressive pool. "Human Vasquez!" Commander Thexvol's voice cracked with what might have been panic. "You are contaminating the observation site!" "Yeah, well, your observation site is about to be underwater anyway," Elena called back, reaching the den entrance just as the first cub got swept out by the current. The little creature was paddling frantically, but losing ground fast. Elena lunged forward, scooping it up just before it would have been carried downstream. The cub immediately latched onto her with all 6 legs, purring like a motorcycle engine and radiating enough body heat to warm her hands. "One down," she muttered, looking back at the den where several more cubs were clustered at the entrance, clearly wanting to flee but too scared to enter the water. "This is fine. This is totally manageable. I'm just going to collect a bunch of alien predator babies like I'm picking up groceries." The expedition team was now in full panic mode, with Commander Thexvol barking orders about contamination protocols and the Rigelian frantically documenting what he kept calling unprecedented behavioral deviation. Elena ignored them all and waded deeper into the den, where the water was now knee-deep and rising fast. The remaining cubs, she counted 5 more, had retreated to the back of the den, which was rapidly becoming a death trap. Elena sloshed toward them, still carrying the first cub, who had apparently decided she was the best thing since sliced bread and was now purring so loudly she could feel it in her ribcage. "Okay, guys," she said to the terrified cubs, using the same tone she'd perfected for calming nervous dogs at the veterinary clinic. "I know I'm weird-looking and probably smell wrong, but right now, I'm your best option for not drowning. So let's work together here." The cubs stared at her with enormous eyes, their bioluminescent stripes pulsing in what she hoped was curiosity rather than preparation for attack. One of them, slightly larger than the others, took a tentative step forward. "That's it," Elena encouraged, reaching out slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to get you out of this water before—" The den ceiling chose that moment to start collapsing as the flood undermined the structural integrity of the burrow. Because of course it did. Elena grabbed the nearest cubs as chunks of alien dirt and rock began raining down around them. The water was now chest-deep and moving like a river, and she had approximately 30 seconds before the whole place came down on their heads. "Well," she said to the cubs clinging to her like furry life preservers, "this is either going to be really heroic or really stupid." Outside, she could hear Commander Thexvol screaming something about extraction protocols, and the Rigelian still providing running commentary, like this was the galaxy's most disturbing nature show. Elena took a deep breath and dove toward the den entrance, 6 alien cubs clinging to her like their lives depended on it. Which, as it turned out, they absolutely did. Elena emerged from the collapsing den like a waterlogged action hero, except instead of looking cool and collected, she was gasping for air and covered in alien mud, while 6 terrified cubs used her as a climbing tree. The expedition team stared at her in what she could only describe as horrified fascination. "Status? Report!" she called out, spitting muddy water and trying to maintain her grip on cubs who apparently thought the best way to show gratitude was to dig their claws into everything. "Everyone still alive and accounted for?" Commander Thexavol's antennae were vibrating so fast they were practically humming. "Human Vasquez, you have committed a severe breach of scientific protocol. The contamination of this observation site will require a complete review of—" "Oh, shut up!" Elena interrupted, wading toward shore with her cargo of purring alien babies. "The observation site is underwater. There's nothing left to contaminate except your precious data logs, and frankly, those could use some contamination." The largest cub, who had appointed himself as her personal bodyguard, was now perched on her shoulders like a very large, very warm scarf. The others had arranged themselves around her torso in what appeared to be a carefully negotiated seating chart, with the smallest one claiming the prime real estate of her left arm. "The cubs appear to have imprinted on the human," observed the Rigelian, his recording device practically smoking from overuse. "This behavior is unprecedented in Vorthak's social structure. Adult Vorthaks typically reject physical contact with non-pack members." "Maybe because I'm not trying to eat them," Elena suggested, finally reaching dry ground and immediately sitting down as 6 cubs decided this was the perfect time for a group snuggle session. "Crazy thought, I know." The Andromedan xenobiologist approached cautiously, as if Elena might suddenly sprout fangs and start attacking people. "Human, are you aware that Vorthak cubs possess venomous bite capabilities? Their saliva contains neurotoxins that can paralyze creatures 3 times their size." Elena looked down at the cub who was currently trying to groom her hair with his tongue. "Huh. That explains the tingling sensation. Good thing I'm not planning to move anytime soon." "You are experiencing neurotoxin exposure?" Commander Thexavol's voice pitched higher with what might have been concern or possibly just fear of paperwork. "Immediate medical intervention may be required." "Relax, I'm fine. It's more like, you know when your foot falls asleep? Except all over." Elena gently scratched behind the ears of the cub in her lap, who immediately began purring louder. "Besides, if they wanted to hurt me, they probably would have done it by now instead of turning me into a jungle gym." That's when the ground started shaking. At first, Elena thought it might be an aftershock from the flood, but the rhythmic pounding suggested something much larger and much more intentional was approaching. The cubs' purring cut off abruptly, and they all turned toward the forest with their ears perked up in identical poses of alert attention. "The adult Vorthaks," whispered the Andromedan. "They have returned." Through the tree line came what could only be described as the stuff of nightmares, if nightmares were 8 feet tall, had more teeth than a shark convention, and moved with the fluid grace of predators who had never met anything they couldn't kill. The adult Vorthaks looked like someone had crossed a saber-toothed tiger with a grizzly bear, and then decided the result wasn't terrifying enough, so they'd added extra claws and bioluminescent threat displays. Elena, still sitting on the ground covered in their offspring, had what she would later describe as a moment of crystal-clear understanding about her current situation. "So," she said conversationally to the cubs, "I'm guessing these are your parents, and they probably have some strong feelings about finding a strange alien holding their babies." The lead Vorthak, presumably the alpha, based on size and the number of scars decorating his massive frame, let out a sound that was part roar, part howl, and entirely designed to make smaller creatures reconsider their life choices. His mate flanked him, slightly smaller but somehow even more intimidating, with the focused intensity of a mother who had come home to find her children missing. The expedition team immediately began backing away, which Elena couldn't really blame them for, but which also left her sitting alone in the middle of what was rapidly becoming a very tense family reunion. "Human Vasquez," Commander Thexvol called from what was now a much safer distance. "Remain absolutely still. Do not make eye contact. Vorthak pack behavior suggests they may interpret any movement as aggression." "Right," Elena said, as 6 cubs continued to use her as furniture, while their parents advanced with the deliberate pace of creatures who had never needed to hurry to catch their prey. "Don't move, don't look at them, and definitely don't explain why I'm covered in their kids. This plan is foolproof." The Alpha Vorthak was now close enough that Elena could see the individual patterns in his bioluminescent stripes, which were currently pulsing in what she was pretty sure wasn't the welcome to the neighborhood pattern. His massive head lowered as he sniffed in her direction, and Elena got a close-up view of teeth that belonged in a museum of prehistoric nightmares. The cub on her shoulders chose that moment to chirp happily and launch himself at his father. Elena watched in fascination as 8 feet of apex predator suddenly transformed into what was essentially a giant, terrifying house cat. The alpha caught his cub mid-leap, and the reunion involved a lot of purring, headbutting, and what appeared to be a detailed conversation in chittering Vorthak that probably translated to, "Where have you been? I was so worried. Also, why do you smell like wet human?" The other cubs, apparently deciding the situation was safe, began abandoning Elena to greet their parents. She found herself suddenly alone and very aware that she was sitting in front of creatures who could probably use her as a toothpick. The Alpha, Vorthak, finished his reunion with his offspring and turned his attention back to Elena. His massive head tilted as he studied her, and she could practically see him trying to figure out what exactly she was and why she smelled like his children. "Hi there," Elena said, because apparently her survival instincts had been replaced by a compulsive need to fill awkward silences. "I'm Elena. I helped your kids not drown. Sorry about the whole interspecies contact thing, but they were kind of in immediate danger of death, so—" The Alpha's response was to step closer and lower his head until they were practically nose to nose. Elena found herself staring into eyes that were ancient, intelligent, and currently trying to solve the puzzle of her existence. Then he did something that made the entire expedition team gasp in unison. He gently headbutted her shoulder in what was unmistakably a gesture of acknowledgement. "Well," Elena said, reaching up to carefully pat his massive head, "I guess that's approval?" The female Vorthak approached more cautiously, but after a thorough sniffing investigation and what appeared to be a consultation with her cubs, she also deemed Elena acceptable. Soon, Elena found herself in the middle of a Vorthak family group hug, which was simultaneously the most terrifying and heartwarming experience of her life. "This is impossible," breathed the Andromedan xenobiologist. "Vorthaks are apex predators. They do not form social bonds with prey species." "Maybe," Elena suggested from her position as honorary pack member, "they don't see me as prey." Commander Thexavol's antennae had stopped vibrating and were now drooping in what she was learning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of a system crash. The implications of this development require immediate consultation with the Galactic Council. Interspecies pack bonding with apex predators has never been documented. "Yeah, well, lots of things have never been documented," Elena said, gently extricating herself from the Vorthak pile so she could stand up. "That doesn't mean they don't happen." The Alpha Vorthak made a sound that was clearly directed at the expedition team, and his tone suggested he wasn't asking them to stay for dinner in a good way. "I believe," said the Rigelian, backing away even faster, "that we are being dismissed from their territory." Elena looked at the Vorthak family, then at the expedition team, then back at the Vorthaks. "Actually, I think you guys should probably head back to the ship. I'm going to stay here for a while." "Absolutely not," Commander Thexvol said immediately. "You cannot remain with wild apex predators. The safety protocols alone—" "The safety protocols," Elena interrupted, as the smallest cub climbed back up her leg to reclaim his spot in her arms, "didn't account for the predators adopting me. I think I'm probably safer here than anywhere else on this planet." The Alpha Vorthak made another sound, this one clearly agreeable, and settled down next to Elena with the satisfied air of someone who had just solved a complex problem. Elena looked at the expedition team, who were staring at her like she'd just announced her intention to juggle live grenades. "Besides, someone needs to study this interspecies bonding thing, right? Might as well be the person who's already been accepted into the pack." Commander Thexvol opened his mouth to argue, then apparently realized he had no actual authority over a human who was currently under the protection of creatures that could eat his entire team for a light snack. "This," he said finally, "is going to require so much paperwork." Elena grinned and settled in next to her new family, who were already arranging themselves for what appeared to be nap time. "Yeah, well, that sounds like a you problem." As the expedition team reluctantly withdrew, Elena couldn't help but notice that the Rigelian was still recording everything, and his expression suggested he was witnessing something that was going to rewrite xenobiology textbooks, which, as it turned out, was probably the understatement of the galactic cycle. 3 days later, Elena's peaceful existence as an honorary Vorthak had been thoroughly disrupted by the arrival of what appeared to be half the Galactic Council's emergency response fleet. The ships had been landing steadily since dawn, disgorging increasingly important-looking officials who all seemed to have very strong opinions about her life choices. "This is ridiculous," Elena muttered to the Alpha Vorthak, who had taken to following her around like a very large, very deadly bodyguard. "It's not like I started an interstellar incident." I just kept some kids from drowning. The Alpha, whose name she had learned was something that roughly translated to renders enemies into component parts, but whom she had taken to calling Rex because life was too short for dramatic alien names, made a rumbling sound that she had learned meant agreement. The latest arrival was a Centaurian diplomatic vessel, which had landed with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for state funerals. Elena watched from the Vorthak den as yet another delegation marched across the landscape in her direction. Human Elena Vasquez, called the lead Centaurian, a tall, elegant creature whose robes probably cost more than Elena's annual salary. I am Senior Diplomat Vexandra of the Centaurian Cultural Exchange Commission. We need to discuss your situation. My situation, Elena repeated, gently untangling herself from the three cubs who had claimed her as their personal climbing structure. You mean the part where I'm not dead? We mean the part where you have apparently formed an unprecedented interspecies pact bond with apex predators, Vexandra replied, eyeing Rex with obvious caution. This development has implications. Elena looked around at the assembled crowd of officials and scientists. Let me guess. Everyone wants to study me like a bug under a microscope. The scientific value of your situation cannot be overstated, said a Rigelian scientist. You represent the first documented case of successful predator-prey species integration. Predator-prey? Elena raised an eyebrow. Is that how you're classifying this? Because I'm pretty sure Rex here doesn't see me as prey. As if to prove her point, Rex moved closer and began grooming her hair with his tongue. The assembled officials took a collective step backward. The Vorthak appears to be exhibiting parental behavior toward you, observed the Rigelian. This suggests a fundamental misclassification of your species' role within their social structure. Or, Elena suggested, it suggests that your understanding of Vorthak's social structure is incomplete. Commander Thexvol stepped forward with his usual air of barely controlled panic. Human Vasquez, the Galactic Council has requested your immediate return for comprehensive evaluation. Elena looked at him, then at Rex, who was now making the low rumbling sound that meant he was annoyed. And if I refuse? You cannot refuse, Vexandra said confidently. This matter concerns galactic security. Your cooperation is not optional. Rex's rumbling got louder, and Elena noticed that other adult Vorthaks had begun emerging from the forest. Apparently, the pack had decided that too many strangers around their adopted human constituted a potential threat. Actually, Elena said, watching as more Vorthaks appeared among the trees, I think my cooperation is entirely optional. See, the thing about being adopted by apex predators is that they tend to have strong feelings about people threatening their family members. The crowd of officials was now significantly outnumbered by creatures that could tear through their environmental suits like tissue paper. Everyone needs to calm down, she said firmly, standing up and placing a hand on Rex's massive shoulder. Nobody's threatening anybody. We're all civilized beings here, right? The Vorthaks are not civilized, protested the Rigelian scientist. They are apex predators operating on instinct. Rex chose that moment to prove him wrong by sitting down and beginning to groom his claws in a display of studied indifference. The other Vorthaks followed suit, creating a scene that looked less like a standoff and more like a very dangerous tea party. Right, Elena said. Pure instinct. No intelligence at all. That's why Rex here has been teaching me Vorthak hunting signals, and their cubs have learned basic standard in 3 days. The smallest cub chose that moment to demonstrate his newfound linguistic skills by announcing, Elena is Pack Mother. Pack Mother stays with Pack. The collective gasp from the assembled officials was audible even over the sound of Rex's purring. They've learned standard, whispered Vexandra. Apex predators have developed linguistic capabilities. They always had linguistic capabilities, Elena corrected. You just never bothered to listen. Vorthaks have a complex social structure, sophisticated communication systems, and apparently, the ability to adopt members from other species. Commander Thexvol's antennae were doing their panic vibration again. The implications of sapient apex predators forming interspecies alliances, the Galactic Council will need to completely revise their classification systems. Yeah. Well, maybe that's not a bad thing, Elena said. Maybe the problem isn't that I've disrupted your scientific understanding. Maybe the problem is that your scientific understanding was wrong. Vexandra stepped forward carefully. Human Vasquez, regardless of the revelations regarding Vorthak intelligence, your situation remains unprecedented. The Galactic Council requires comprehensive study. And I'm sure they do, Elena replied. But here's the thing. I'm not a lab rat, and neither are the Vorthaks. If the Council wants to study interspecies cooperation, they can start by treating both species as equals in the conversation. Rex made a sound that was clearly approval, and the other Vorthaks began moving closer in a display of pack solidarity. You're proposing negotiations, Vexandra said slowly, between the Galactic Council and apex predators. I'm proposing, Elena said, that you recognize sapient beings as sapient beings, regardless of how many teeth they have. The Vorthaks are clearly intelligent, clearly capable of complex social relationships, and clearly interested in expanding their social circle beyond their own species. That makes them candidates for council membership, not subjects for study. The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either breakthrough diplomatic agreements or complete societal collapse. This is impossible, muttered Commander Thexval. Apex predators cannot be granted council membership. The security implications alone. The security implications, Elena interrupted, might actually be in your favor. Think about it. Would you rather have apex predators as allies or as unknowns lurking in uncharted space? The assembled officials began exchanging urgent whispers. Elena couldn't understand most of it, but the tone was universally one of people realizing that their entire worldview might need major adjustments. That's when the Cubs decided to demonstrate their own diplomatic skills, by approaching the officials with fearless curiosity. Within minutes, Elena was watching a Centaurian diplomat being thoroughly investigated by a six-legged alien toddler who was clearly fascinated by her robes. They're not aggressive, observed one of the military observers, sounding genuinely surprised. Of course they're not aggressive, Elena said. They're children. Children are naturally curious and social, regardless of species. Rex made another approving sound and began herding the Cubs back toward Elena, but not before each one had managed to make physical contact with at least one official. The message was clear. The Vorthaks were claiming the entire group as part of their extended social circle. Vexandra looked down at her robes, which now bore clear evidence of Cub investigation, then up at Elena. You're suggesting that interspecies cooperation is a learnable behavior. I'm suggesting, Elena said, that cooperation is the default behavior when you treat other beings as people instead of obstacles. The question is whether the Galactic Council is ready to learn that lesson. The ground began shaking again, and Elena realized that their little family meeting was about to get significantly more complicated. Through the forest came what appeared to be every adult Vorthak on the planet, moving in coordinated formation. Elena looked at the approaching army of apex predators, then at the crowd of increasingly nervous officials, then back at Rex, who was practically radiating smug satisfaction. You called for backup, she said. Rex's response clearly meant, obviously. Did you think we were going to let strangers threaten our pack mother? Elena grinned and settled in to watch what was probably going to be the most interesting diplomatic negotiation in galactic history. 6 months later, Elena sat in what had formerly been Conference Room 7 of the Galactic Council's primary diplomatic station, but which was now officially designated as the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Facility. The room had been extensively modified to accommodate beings who were significantly larger than the average council member. The Andromedan Trade Coalition is requesting permission to establish mining operations in the Outer Spiral, announced Vexandra, who had somehow become the council's primary liaison to what the media had dubbed the Apex Alliance. Rex, who was sprawled across what used to be a conference table, made a sound that Elena had learned meant, absolutely not, and also, are they insane? Rex says no, Elena translated helpfully. Also, he wants to know if they've completely lost their minds. The Vorthaks cannot simply reject legitimate trade proposals, protested the Andromedan representative. There are established protocols for resource allocation. Right, Elena said, scratching behind Rex's ears. And those protocols were established when you thought apex predators were just really dangerous animals. Now that we know they're really dangerous people, the protocols need some updates. The smallest cub, now significantly larger, but still claiming Elena as his personal furniture, looked up from his position in her lap and addressed the Andromedan directly. Mining makes water dirty. Dirty water kills fish. No fish, no food for cubs, no mining in pack territory. The silence that followed was one Elena had become very familiar with. The sound of galactic civilization having its assumptions challenged by a creature that most beings still instinctively wanted to classify as a pet. The juvenile has a point, admitted Commander Thexval, whose job title had been upgraded to Senior Coordinator for Unprecedented Biological Diplomacy. Environmental impact assessments were not considered necessary for uninhabited systems. Uninhabited, Elena repeated. Right, because apex predators don't count as inhabitants. The truth was, Elena had accidentally become something the galaxy had never had before. A translator not just of languages, but of fundamental assumptions about intelligence and society. Her ability to recognize intelligence in unfamiliar forms had made her invaluable to a galactic community that was rapidly discovering how much it didn't know about itself. Speaking of which, Elena said, checking the agenda display, we have the Kepler system delegation arriving this afternoon. How's everyone feeling about negotiating with sentient plants? The collective groan from the assembled diplomats was audible across 3 species hearing ranges. The botanical entities from Kepler-7 cannot possibly possess the cognitive complexity necessary for meaningful diplomatic relations, insisted the Rigelian xenobiologist, who had been making similar statements for months and had been wrong every single time. Right, Elena said. Just like the Vorthaks couldn't possibly possess linguistic capabilities, and the crystalline collective couldn't possibly have developed quantum mathematics. The afternoon's negotiations with the Kepler botanical entities went about as well as could be expected, which was to say that Elena spent 3 hours in a makeshift greenhouse, explaining to sentient redwoods why the Galactic Council's standard mining contracts were problematic when applied to beings whose root systems extended across entire continents. The root network finds your reproductive cycles amusingly brief, Elena translated as one of the larger trees rustled its leaves in polite condescension. But they're willing to establish limited trade agreements provided that all mining operations are conducted in consultation with local ecosystem management. The negotiations concluded with what Elena considered a reasonable compromise. The botanical entities would provide advanced agricultural techniques in exchange for protection from unauthorized development and a seat on the newly formed Environmental Oversight Committee. As the various delegations filed out, Elena found herself alone with Rex and the cubs, who had spent the afternoon napping in the artificial sunlight. "So," she said to Rex, "how do you think that went?" Rex's response meant, "adequately, though the tree people could probably eat the crystal people if they wanted to." Elena laughed and settled back against Rex's massive flank. 6 months ago, I was just a veterinarian who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." The largest cub looked up from his position sprawled across her legs. Pack Mother was in right place at right time. Pack needed Pack Mother. Galaxy needed Pack Mother. Elena considered this. Her accidental adoption by the Vorthaks had led to a complete restructuring of galactic civilization's understanding of intelligence and personhood. Species that had been dismissed as primitive were now recognized as full members of the galactic community. The Galactic Council had tripled in size as previously unknown civilizations emerged from the shadows. The door chimed, and Vexandra entered with careful steps. "Elena," she said, "we've received a communication from the Outer Rim territories. Several previously uncontacted systems are requesting diplomatic recognition." "How many systems?" Elena asked. 47. "And they're all claiming to have been inspired by what they're calling the Vorthak precedent." Elena looked at Rex, who was now making the sound that meant, "Pack Mother's influence spreads beyond immediate territory, which may cause logistical difficulties." 47, Elena repeated. "So we're going from a galaxy where most species were considered non-sapient to a galaxy where apparently everyone's been sapient all along, they just weren't invited to the conversation." "That appears to be an accurate assessment," Vexandra confirmed. "The Council is concerned about the administrative implications. Elena grinned and stood up, gently dislodging cubs who immediately began protesting. Well, I guess we'd better get started. Rex, how do you feel about expanding the pack to include 47 new species? Rex's response meant, Pack Mother chooses pack members. Pack protects Pack Mother's choices. Right then, Elena said, looking out at the stars beyond. I guess we're going to need a bigger conference room. As she watched, another ship appeared in the distance, probably carrying another delegation of newly recognized sapient beings. The future was going to be complicated, chaotic, and probably completely insane. Elena couldn't wait. Come on, she said to her pack, who were already gathering around her. Let's go meet our new neighbors. Rex made a sound that roughly translated to, Pack Mother makes Galaxy more interesting, which is good for Pack and probably good for Galaxy, though Galaxy may not realize this yet. Elena laughed and headed for the door, followed by 8 feet of apex predator and 6 cubs who had appointed themselves as her personal diplomatic security detail. The Galaxy was about to get very interesting indeed.